Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
How are we doing?
Good. And yeah,
Yeah, not too bad. Oh, knackered today, though. Don't know why. I'm just going to have to keep muting because my housemate's in another meeting at the same time.
out of work.
Hey guys.
Hello, how are you?
Hey.
Yeah, wonderful. How you doing?
Good.
You-
I'm fine.
Hey, everybody.
Hey Stacy.
Yeah.
Morning.
Howdy.
All right, let me pull up the notes quickly. Anyone have a strong desire to be a scribe today?
It's a pass from me.
Okay.
What I missed.
I was just asking if anyone wanted to be a scribe today. And so far people aren't jumping at the opportunity.
I heard it's last person to join the call is a scribe, so Todd, that's you.
That makes sense. Oh, no.
Oh.
David, would you mind being scribe?
We're just
Yeah.
now people are just getting specifically called out.
Yeah. I always get sidetracked, so it's better to let someone else handle it. So, all right. I'll link out the doc if you don't mind just adding yourself to the participants list. And if you have any agenda items, feel free to go ahead and add yourself. And we can go ahead and get started. All right. Cool. I'll start off with the, I didn't add my name here, but I guess I'll handle it. We did release the version 060 of the spec last week. And so there's also a blog post that I had put together. It's not released yet, but I did get some feedback yesterday reviewing that. And if all looks good, we can go ahead and release it. Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, so if you have any questions, definitely take a look at it. But I tried to cover a quick summary of what each like major feature in the new spec is, and then kind of a couple of use cases around it. And then also tease basically that the next part of the spec is going to be client-side support. Is something that's this release sets us up hopefully nicely for, and Todd's already has like either a draft PR or a PR ready to rock already. So yeah, take a look at the blog, take a look at the release, and then yeah, definitely help out if you're interested in the client side spec, because I think that's definitely going to be a hot topic. Todd, did you have anything to add there? I see that you added some stuff.
Just really minor. The only thing I'll add a link to it. This is a query. The thing I just put in under that point. This is a query that basically searches the whole org for issues or PRs with the V060 label. So if there's a PR or an issue related to implementing 060, it will show up there. If you open an issue and it is related to anything implementing this, just go ahead and add the label. I'm trying to do that myself, but it'll just give us an overview of that kind of stuff. And obviously you can filter by repo and that type of thing too.
Yeah, cool. Any questions or anything to add on that section before I move on? Cool. All right. Next one, this is something Kavindu he had a conflict today, so he wasn't able to join and talk about it himself, but we did create this metrics OFAP earlier in the week. And basically to quickly summarize it, we were just trying to figure out for a OpenTelemetry metrics plugin for OpenFeature, which type of metrics would we like to capture, what we would like to call them, and if or in what dimensions would we like to be able to split these metrics on. So that was the intention behind that one. I think we're pretty close. I just want to kind of do like a last call if there's anyone that wants to take a look and provide feedback, please do, because otherwise we'll probably merge tomorrow. The only part that's maybe that I'd like a little bit more input on, well, anything you can of course provide input on, but the one that I'm a little uncertain on is this scope dimension that I've defined here. And basically there's one piece that makes splitting these metrics maybe a little bit tricky. And for those unfamiliar, the dimension is a way to basically like divide a metric. So if you're looking at like impressions over time or something like that, you can use dimensions as like you could either split or filter on these dimensions. And so some obvious dimensions would be like a flag key. So you could filter on that, for example. So if you wanted to see like impressions over time filtered by a key, you'd use the key dimension. But then how would we split or filter on a particular like environment, for example? So if you think of like a lot of feature flagging use cases, like you have a core feature flag, and then it's the definitions are basically changed per environment. And so we would need some understanding of maybe like the project and environment that a flag was in, for example. And that terminology varies across tools and vendors. So the proposal I have out there right now is scope. So if we basically let the provider optionally supply as flag metadata the scope of this flag, which would be kind of up to the provider to define, but it could be like it could be an ID, it could be like a like a namespaced project and environment, however like the provider would want to do it. If it comes across in a flag key, which is part of the updated spec, by the way, the OpenTelemetry hooks can basically use that and add that as a dimension. If it's omitted, it would not be added as dimension. So it's a totally optional piece, but we do need something like that. I just don't know what we want to call it. And so scope seems to be the most like general purpose term that I could think of. But if people have ideas, naming is always difficult. So feel free to like comment on that and we can talk about what that should be called. That's it kind of in a nutshell. Any questions on the metrics or dimensions or anything like that?
I'm not
Alright.
I'm not an OpenTelemetry expert by any means, but my understanding of the problem you're describing too is kind of like another way to put it would be just a way to namespace flags. Like environment is kind of one way that you might want to namespace them, but you may, for instance, in the context of one telemetry backend, you may have multiple clashing flag keys just in different projects. Like it may be that one project has or application has a flag key that clashes with another flag key in a different project, and they're logically separate things. So you could use the scope to kind of segregate those as well, even if you're not doing it per environment. So it's just like a general namespacing, I would say. Also, is that right?
Yeah, something along those lines. And I think the terminology there's a bit tricky, but maybe it just really comes down to like whatever our definition of this dimension is. And that should be maybe clear enough. So one of the things that we talked about in the OFAP was to define what a scope means in our glossary, and maybe that's sufficient here. All right. So related to the OFAP, we our project or our OpenFeature itself was actually accepted as I guess mentors in the Google Summer of Code. So it'll be myself and David acting as mentors for Mihir. So you'll probably see him around on Slack. His project is basically to streamline the OFAP process. And so right now we're working on like kind of defining an ideal flow. And so if you have any ideas, feedback, pain points, whatever, certainly let me know. Because my main goal is like if we can do a nice job, like kind of streamlining this enhancement process, we could, basically hopefully donate it to other CNCF projects and other projects that like, have similar processes in place. So we started outlining, I think what an ideal flow would look like. And then here we'll be implementing that, writing documentation, and then creating some like automations around that as well. One that I think particularly could be interesting is essentially like once we achieve all of the approvals that we need, having a bot that basically does like a last call. So it would say like, you know, we've achieved this. This will be merged at this date unless someone, you know, speaks up essentially, and then basically it kind of takes like the emotion out of the merge and release. It's just like we've gotten the approvals. You have your chance to stop it. If you don't, for whatever reason, it's just going to merge. We can of course make amendments later, but it just makes that process, you know, pretty straightforward. And I think we could also apply that logic in other places in the project.
Yeah, I think we should also look, especially for the OFAB process. We discussed this also in the governance board before, whether everything that right now is an OFAB should really be an OFAB or should just be an issue. Because some of them are actually issues. More
Yes,
than OFAB. So I think if
I
you don't
agree.
really change
It's like the scope.
or extend it, then it shouldn't even be an OFAB. Because obviously the OFABs then go to the TC, they go to the governance board and not just to the maintainers, which usually makes the move obviously slower, but obviously not necessarily the expertise is with them as well. Like for spec changes, I think if it still is in the same scope of the spec that we had defined and it's just more implementation related, it shouldn't even make it to an OFAB necessarily.
Yeah, I think, and we can hopefully leverage some ideas and things from like OpenTelemetry, for example, for that. You know, features shouldn't necessarily require an OFAP unless it touches multiple repositories or, you know, changes SDK behavior across multiple SDK, things like that. So that is part of the things that Mahir is going to look at, is basically what should require an OFAP and what wouldn't. So clarifying
I
that
just bring
behavior.
it up because I think there is some urgency there. Because right now the OFAB process, the way the repository is structured for approval, it would allow you to merge even if not all GC members have agreed to merge. And as soon as we switch this over, we will have a much harder time to approve OFABs. Like looking at the one we just discussed about the metrics before, none of the GC members currently has approved. We have taught from the TC. So I think we should define this rather sooner than later.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if a GC member even need to be approving an OFAP, but I guess that's something that we could certainly talk about, adding those
An OFAB
requirements.
changes the scope of the project. An issue, definitely not. I think that's why we need to have that clear distinction, and I think we should have this rather sooner than later. That's why I'm bringing it up here.
Okay. I mean, that's as simple as like a code owner's file. So I guess if that's what we want to do.
Oh, I know I can enforce it, but I want to have the rules in place. That's my point. Like what has to go into an OFAB? What is fine being an issue?
Yep.
The
I mean,
enforcement would not
also
be
keep in
the-
mind, it was to streamline it too. So I don't want to have too many processes in place. Otherwise it like discourages, you know, people from using it. But yeah, point taken. I think, yeah, figuring out what it like once it's in place and we have approvals, like what constitutes like an accepted thing. And all it needs to do is be well defined and understood. And I think it's, yeah, pretty straightforward. Okay. Yeah. So I guess to quickly summarize that, we're working on the process. If you have any ideas or complaints, you know, there's a couple issues open right now in the OFAP repo, and you may see Mahir around both on GitHub and then in Slack as well. So he's a student, and yeah, so definitely help him out if he has any questions. And yeah, I think it's gonna work out well. That's it for that section. Any questions about Google Summer of Code or that OFAP process? All right. Just a reminder, here's the notes if anyone wants to add any agenda items. Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Todd.
Yeah, I'll be pretty quick. We still have basically one remaining PR open to the spec. 171, I've linked it there. It's been open for quite a while, but it was in a draft state for a long time. And the reason was it basically contained everything we kind of believed would be necessary for client support, adequate client support in OpenFeature. So it included events and initialization and shutdown, which are now part of the spec proper. So really now the only remaining delta is this static dynamic context stuff, which is basically the only thing left in the PR. So this static dynamic versus dynamic context stuff. Pete did a great blog post on it. I've kind of mentioned it in these meetings more than once. If you want background, I definitely would recommend checking that out for like some philosophical background. I'll add it to the document here. But yeah, take a look at the spec change. The interesting thing about the spec change is that there's a lot of conditions, and it essentially won't impact any server-side SDKs. So it won't impact any of the current SDKs that are really intended for server-side usage. It's basically how the web SDK is currently implemented, the experimental web SDK, and it would be how mobile SDKs would be implemented. So take a look at that. If you're not super familiar with client use cases, be them mobile or web, maybe refer the PR to somebody who might be interested. I'd love to get more input, especially from mobile application developers on that stuff. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say there. Any questions, comments on that?
The word static, like we have some customers that will sometimes like instantiate multiple SDKs on the client, or occasionally like change the, I don't know if it's splitting hairs. Like when I read it through, I didn't comment about this in GitHub because I wasn't sure if it was just like, I don't know, like whether there's a slightly better word for static, because it's not sort of by right static, right? Like
that's the next thing I need to do.
It's not complex because like in Flagsmith, they're not immutable. Well, they can be overwritten, right?
Yeah, it's a kind of a relative term, honestly. Static, I agree. Static isn't perfect. I think if we don't like that terminology, I'm totally open to changing it. It's already changed from like single user from multi-context to single context, because that wasn't quite accurate either. It's that it's more static, and that changing the context is expensive and frequently involves some kind of network traffic. So yeah, the context isn't really static entirely. It's just that it very likely won't change across evaluations, right? In the server side, we have a very dynamic context in that basically request to request, event to event, the context is completely different. It usually represents a totally different HTTP request, a totally different user. For the client side, the context is much more static, right? It's a user who logs in. It's maybe changed when some attribute about that user changes. If they add something to their cart, if they change their username, that type of thing. So it's more static, but yeah, it's not static. I'm totally open to changing that terminology and make that clear if anybody has any ideas.
Yeah, I think it is worth looking at. It's just hard because it's like dynamic or less dynamic or something. Like, so if we can come up with
We
a better
could just
term.
have more static and more dynamic. I know it's really tough. I mean, just Jonathan, I kind of, yeah, like server. It's kind of this classic thing, right? It's like, do you want to be like, are you software engineering or are you computer science? Like, where that's the kind of where these are lying. I kind of like static and dynamic, but we definitely want to make it clear that like these aren't like, they're not rigorously static, right? Like it's not static in the way that someone writing the language, a piece of code would think of it, right? Like it's, yeah, I think as long as it's clear and that the sort of, it's because like we have people do sort of like weird stuff. They instantiate 3 instances of the client side SDK to do weird things just because they have to for whatever reason. And people could be like, oh, I can't do that because it's static. I don't know.
I think that was kind of the point though, to be honest, like to make it work across as many tools as possible. Like we want to not discourage people from setting context, but we want to like make it clear that it's a relatively expensive operation. But static, I think we can think of a better name. And maybe it's even worth, I forget why we pivoted away from client server. I know we started there. But maybe we just circle all the way back to, to that term. Who knows? Do you remember why, Todd?
I think because we projected that the client might be used in cases where it's not actually a client application because it's not part of a client server architecture. So, you know, if you have some like desktop application, it may have feature flags and not necessarily be a client of anything. That's like a fairly niche case. I'm not necessarily against the client server. That's practically how it's probably going to work out in a lot of situations.
I think static and dynamic infers more information than client and server, which assumes knowledge, right?
Yeah, the only other one I had there was like maybe user context, and I don't know, I don't really like global context, but maybe because like one's kind of user specific, right? Like the context is kind of specific to that user, and then the other one's more dynamic because the user can change per request.
We could do single versus multi-user too as well, though. Yeah,
Though we wanted to shy away from user too, so that was the other challenge.
Yeah, I mean, quite there's there's definitely a set of people that aren't identifying as a human being at all in context. Yeah.
What if you have something like, I mean, the current implementation is like setting it on the client. It could be something like a client context or so that it implies that it's like the context bound to that client, which doesn't imply not changeable, but also doesn't apply any semantics for what it's used for.
Yeah, that feels like more like the user context versus client context versus global context that Jonathan proposed. But I mean, yeah, I think this is mostly a language thing. It won't really change much about the implementation, but it is important that we communicate clearly what this means, right? So I'm happy to take this discussion offline and create an issue, and like maybe we can have a whole bunch of proposals and like add points to them and vote on them.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach. It's not a technical thing. It's just a communication issue. So yeah, I think we can kind of summarize what we talked about here. And if you don't mind capturing that in an issue and then putting it in Slack or something, let's see what we can do. Cool. Yeah, any other thoughts on that one? Otherwise, I think we can probably move on to your next topic, Todd.
Yeah, the other one is really short and sweet. So we basically kind of rotated the technical committee. That's not based on any policy. It was just like we went kind of from a bootstrapping technical committee that kind of helped us get started to a new TC. Yeah, the nominees were Thomas, who's in the call, as well as Ryan Lamb, who is not with us today. He's West Coast, I believe, so it's hard for him to make these calls. But yeah, they're both helping out on the TC along with myself. So you'll see them in PRs, you'll see them reviewing the spec and stuff like that, and on calls and stuff like this. Keep in mind, you can self-nominate for the TC if you're interested in joining. We do have some restrictions on composition and what companies people are from, that sort of thing. But if you're interested in the responsibilities, you can see the community contributor ladder, I think, has that, as well as the technical committee charter. So yeah, thanks to Ryan and Thomas. That's really all I had.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. And just to kind of clarify Todd's statement on that too, there's no like, companies that are excluded or something. It's just to make sure that there's proper, representation and stuff. So if it's of interest and you're able to kind of fulfill the requirements, certainly, let us know. Like definitely, I think having a more like filled out TC could benefit the project in general. So yeah, definitely if you're interested, let us know. We can take a look. It looks like probably David added this. We used to have this at the beginning all the time. I don't actually know if there's anyone that's like brand new for the first time, but if there is, or if you haven't had a chance to introduce yourself, if you want to unmute and say hi, feel free. And
I can go, Mike. I am brand new.
Oh.
Hey, I've just been kind of like fly on the wall, so nothing really to contribute here. But I'm Max. Was turned on to the OpenFeature project a couple of months ago because we've been migrating our monolith. I work for a company called JustWorks, so trying to decide how we handle a single provider, but then keep the evaluation unified, which is OpenFeature. And so it's been good to find that out. We are a Rails shop primarily, branching into Golang, Rustlang, some other things. And so our biggest challenge was having a functional Ruby SDK to at least get the features of the spec that we need today, which is basically the provider evaluation and then the context. So we took it upon ourselves to write a Ruby one, just because the official one didn't have the context stuff that we needed yet and the provider interface. But we use something called Sorbet, which is a rabbit hole in the Ruby community. And so ours is Sorbet aware, which makes it not a great candidate to be upstreamed as the official Ruby implementation, because you probably don't want to introduce that dependency. But anyway, it was fun getting to implement off of a specification, and we're about almost done with hooks, which was, we started this before 0.6 was released last week. And then once we're finished with hooks, we'll pull in some of the new features like the initialize, startup, terminate, that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's been fun, and it's been fun to attend this just to see how the back end of the spec works.
awesome. Yeah, welcome. I knew your name was familiar, so I apologize for not remembering that you weren't in a meeting or not, but
Popped into the
nice to
Slack
meet you. And
last week.
yeah, certainly let us know if you have any issues with the spec or, you know, clarity, and maybe we do figure out a way. I mean, I'm assuming if you guys are using, you know, Sorbet and Ruby, you're probably not alone. So maybe there are opportunities to link there or whatever. So
yeah,
it sounds really.
There's definitely like some interplay we could do. We're also interested, once we do the Sorbet one, in upstreaming some of the stuff we can into the primary one as well. So yeah, that just kind of looks like ripping out the Sorbet specific stuff and then embracing more of the duck typing paradigm in Ruby. So it's actually easier to kind of work backwards from like the more strict type system approach.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Yeah, and those ones, like that one in particular, is like sub 1.0, which is why it hasn't really been released, or it's not in the docs or anything like that. So yeah, if you have some stuff that we can go upstream, that would be awesome to make that a 1.0 release.
Max, I have a super quick question. I don't really know much about Sorbet. Like, I'm just curious to know, like, how is it being adopted widely in the Ruby community, and is it to Ruby what TypeScript is to JavaScript roughly? Is that right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from the adoption side of things, you're seeing a lot of it. The projects originated in Stripe and still maintained by them. So I mean, they're like kind of a big gorilla in the Ruby ecosystem. Notably, they don't actually use Rails, which is kind of the other side of the coin when most people talk about Ruby. But Shopify, who's the other big gorilla that uses Rails, also stewards that project in some capacity too. So you see a lot of enterprises really embracing it, just because once you get to like Ruby paradigms start to break down around 50 engineers. And so having the type system starts to help out tremendously there. In terms of like how it relates to TypeScript, it's very close, and it's like a similar idea of let's add like static guarantees to a dynamic language. Implementations are slightly different. So like TypeScript transpiles into JavaScript at the end of the day, whereas Sorbet kind of has like two modes you can operate under. One is purely static, where you're not bringing anything about like Sorbet into Ruby, which works well with non-Sorbet projects. And then there's another approach where you can actually use something called Sorbet runtime, where you get Ruby constants you can actually utilize. So things like enum. So like Ruby doesn't have a built-in enum. So the Sorbet team built like a T enum class that you can inherit from and actually get like an exhaustive enumeration, which is super handy. There's a struct in there, which we use extensively in our OpenFeature spec, which gives you like immutable fields, that kind of idea, a lot easier out of the box. Immutable fields with type information, I should say. And so that's kind of the difference is if you opt for that runtime thing, you're basically forcing anyone who pulls in your library to also pull in the Sorbet runtime library. And, you know, depending on the team, they might not want to do that. And that introduces a somewhat controversial thing in like a type system, right? So if people don't want a type system, they're going to be like, I don't want to pull this in. And that's why it's a little bit trickier than TypeScript, where you can tree shape that stuff out and still get a lot of the at like development time, a lot of the affordances. But you know, Sorbet puts it into the like dependency chain, which becomes problematic. So that's what I say when I mean there's probably like an official SDK that if you just wanted a vanilla Ruby implementation, there's a way forward with that. That is less strict from a type standpoint, but still satisfies the specification. And then there's like the more rigorous Sorbet one where you'll actually get way better type guarantees, right? So
yeah, which I think like,
yeah,
I mean, I think OpenFeature solves the problem for like larger orgs. Like if you're on a really small project, like there's still value, of course, but like, yeah. So I think, yeah, having something like Sorbet could be really interesting to officially include somewhere, but I think figuring out where that lives and how that is included in the project is maybe a deeper discussion for another time. But yeah, really interesting. I know very little about Ruby, to be honest. Awesome. Yeah, anything else? Or basically out of agenda items. And unless someone else wants to, I think we've met everyone. Oh, the last thing I want to mention real quick is the 060 spec is pretty far along in implementation in the JavaScript SDK. So thanks, Lucas, for a lot of your effort over the last week. I think almost everything is included in the latest pull request, excuse me. So once that's merged and approved, I think that will be likely the first SDK with full 060 support. So if you're looking for like kind of implementation, you know, like a reference implementation, you know, take a look at that SDK for some ideas. That is basically it. Anything else? No, thumbs up from Todd. A wave from James. All right. I guess that's it. We can wrap up. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Have a
y'all.
good day.
Bye.
We'll talk to you
Yeah.
later.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys. See ya.